the cloud. Hello, welcome to our lunch study break here at Congregation Beth Sholom. Today is May 12th, and we are blessed to have with us Samuel Salkin. Samuel Salkin, as many of you probably already know, he is the director of Sinai Memorial Chapel here in San Francisco, and he has written a book called Reflections on Jewish Death and Mourning, Respect, Ritual, and Remembrance. And I'm actually going to put a little link that he has provided for us on why a Jewish funeral into the chat for those who are interested, and that will have his book. Actually, the entire book is there, so you can go and download that PDF. And he's joined us on an important topic. And he reached out to us and he said, during the pandemic, it's come to the attention at Sinai that more and more people are having anxiety about their finitude. Here at Sinai, we are able to give people greater peace of mind by helping them understand how they can make advanced plans for the end of their life, both for a funeral and a final resting place. As a nonprofit, Sinai is offering a service to our members as well as gives back to the greater community at large. And so this is an important topic. I think it's a topic that has been on some of our minds, in particular in the past year, as Sinai Memorial Chapel mentioned, as more people begin to think about their own mortality. And so Sam has joined us today, and together we're going to discuss what does it mean to plan in advance for your death? What in our Jewish tradition might encourage the advanced planning? And what are the core things to think about when we are going to make an advanced plan for our death? So those are obviously difficult topics to discuss. And we acknowledge that they're challenging to discuss. And that's why I think we're blessed that Sam Salkin is here with us today, because it's an important topic for members of our community, for the Jewish world at large. And it's a topic that I feel personally we might not discuss until we absolutely have to, or past the point in which we absolutely have to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go full screen on Sam Salkin, and he can give you a little bit of an introduction about his work and about what he does at Sinai and about advanced planning. And then, you know, like Kara and Sam, I like to ask questions and create dialogue here. So I would just have you give a little bit of an introduction, tell us about your work, tell us why it's important to think about advanced planning, some of the things we might want to consider. And then I know people here will have questions for you, as will I. So I'm going to full screen you, and thank you for coming and to have this important conversation with us.
Rabbi Ain, thank you very much. And everybody who was here in attendance, thank you very much. And Rabbi, I see that you were even able to attract your father to this lunchtime meeting. So Stuart, good to see you for the first time face-to-face, even though we've spoken voice-to-voice. Thank you for this opportunity. I think, as the Rabbi said, the pandemic has raised people's concerns and anxieties around our own finitude. What I'd like to do today is two things for my part, and then I'll turn this over to Kara, who is our advanced planning subject matter expert and specialist. And we'll do our best to have plenty of time for questions and answers. And if in fact there's not enough time, we will certainly create opportunities to answer your questions through the chat and one-on-one. For those of you who have availed yourself the opportunity to take a look at the book that I wrote and edited, one of the things that we should begin with, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to teach a little Torah, and then I'm going to talk about Sinai, and then and that'll transition into pre-planning, advanced planning. So there is not a lot of halacha around the question of end of life, death, dying, funerals, burials, mourning. There's a tremendous amount of minhagim, customs. And those customs vary by communities, both formerly geographic communities, but also sub-communities within our community, because we have a very diverse community here. And so I once had a conversation with a conservative rabbi in our community who emphatically said to me, Jews don't have flowers at funerals. And I said, of course they do. They just don't have flowers at the funerals that you officiate at, because our brothers and sisters who came here from the former Soviet Union have a profusion of flowers at their funerals. And I just use that as an illustration. So starting with Torah. The Torah doesn't say a lot about this, but it does say a lot if you look at the world through the lens that I do. So let's start with the first death and burial in the Torah. In Chaya Sarah, we have Avraham Avinu negotiating to purchase a burial plot, a cave at Machpelah. And it is very elaborate for those of you who remember the Sedra, very elaborate, and it involves a tremendous amount of real estate negotiation. And Avraham ends up paying what the text infers is an exorbitant price. But it's very important to Avraham, and Avimelech, who owns the land or the cave, is willing to give it to Avraham. But Avraham doesn't want the gift, and it's not that he's ungrateful, but he needs to establish himself and therefore us in the land. And I don't want to belabor the Parsha, but what I want to say is Chaya Sarah, the life of Sarah, is the name of the Parsha. And what we focus on is the death of Sarah and real estate negotiations. And so therefore, the first death that we face of our matriarch has us focused on things that none of the rest of us should ever focus on. We should have made arrangements for our funerals. We should know where we want our resting place to be to the extent that we can do that. And we should make plans even if they're not 100% complete. We should start the process of planning, because we don't actually know how Avraham, according to the Torah, there's Medrash about this, but we don't know how Avraham Avinu felt about the death of Sarah. We know a whole lot about how he felt about negotiating the purchase of the real estate. So object lesson 1 from the Torah that says the lesson for our conversation is, to the extent possible, start to make your plans. And for some of you, you'll just do it 1, 2, 3. You'll know what you want, and Kara will help you do it. And for others of you, it'll be a series of conversations, because you may want your funeral here, but you may want to be buried in Cleveland, or you may want to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. And we can accommodate whatever you want, but you may not know exactly what you want. And we're here to help you clarify it and we're here to listen and help you get what you want. So first notion in the Torah. Second notion is the passing of Jacob. And Jacob is very specific. He is in Mitzrayim. He thinks of himself as a stranger in that land. And he's very clear with his next of kin that he wants to be gathered unto his kin, and he wants to be buried where he came from. He had a plan. His next of kin knew exactly what he wanted, and they could make sure he got what he wanted. And the third one that I want to just touch on for a moment is Joseph. Joseph knew that even though he had risen to be the grand vizier of Paro in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, he knew he wanted to be gathered unto his kin, and he knew he wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. And he could not have foreseen that in order for that to happen, his future brothers and sisters were going to be enslaved for 400 years. But let's remember, during that 40 years of wandering in the desert, they carried the bones of Joseph that perhaps were embalmed, something we don't talk about a lot, but perhaps were embalmed. And there were therefore in the desert, and we're going to come up on this on Sunday night, Monday, Tuesday, there were 2 Aarons. There was the aron, which was the Hebrew word for casket or coffin that carried the bones of Joseph. And then there was the aron that carried the 10 Commandments in the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai at Shavuot. So there were two arons, but the multitude of Yidden and non-Yidden that Jews, that Hebrews actually, not Yidden, Hebrews, who carried Joseph from Egypt to be buried in the promised land, they did this for 40 years. So not only did he know what he wanted, but his community knew what he wanted, and they were able to honor his wishes. So I use these as three examples that to make the case from our tradition of why it's important that Jews pre-plan. And by the way, if you went to an industry resource and said, so tell me about the profile of people who pre-plan, there are three groups of people in our society that preponderantly pre-plan: African Americans, Asians, and Jews. And so there's a strong tradition in the Jewish community of pre-planning. I'm going to transition from talking Torah to talking a little bit about Sinai. Rabbi Ain, in his introduction, gave you some background. For those of you who have been in the community for a period of time, you probably take what we do for granted. It's like, oh, it's a funeral home, it's the Chevra Kadisha, you know, they're here for us. They have a long history of taking care of the indigent. I didn't know they spent $250,000 last year doing that, but I'm not surprised. But we are a unique institution in American Jewish life, and there is literally no other Jewish institution in America like Sinai. In almost all communities, the Jewish funeral home is a for-profit enterprise, either owned by a large conglomerate or in some cases still by families, although that family ownership is coming to an end in many, many towns and cities. And the Chevra Kadisha then is either a communal institution or a congregationally regulated institution that comes to the for-profit funeral home to do its work. There are a few not-for-profit Jewish funeral homes in this country, but none of them are like Sinai. So if you were in Detroit, you could use Detroit Hebrew, but it's an Orthodox institution and it serves the Orthodox community. So the genius of Sinai Memorial, which I can certainly take no credit for, it goes back to the 19th century, is that the rabbi that's officiating at the funeral is the Mara Da'atra, is the judge, is the decider. So when we do a funeral for a congregant at Beth Sholom, we don't do it the Sinai way. We do it Rabbi Ain's way, or we do it Rabbi Russell's way. And there may be subtle differences between Rabbi Ain and Rabbi Russell. Very small, very subtle. We know what the differences are. We do it their way. So the genius is that we can serve the entire spectrum of our community almost in its broadest definition. So sometimes people will say, well, you know, are there issues with Tahara, with LGBTQ trans people? We've served that community before those 5 letters were put together by 100 years. No issues at all. How about intermarried families? Almost no issues at all. And the fact of the matter is that we serve the spectrum of our community from conservative, Orthodox, Reform, Renewal, Reconstructionist, Chabad, Karaites that in some communities would not be considered Jews, and we embrace them as our brothers and sisters. So we're an institution here that serves the entire spectrum of the community, and we are the only Jewish funeral service between Seattle and Los Angeles, the only one. So even though our primary service area is the Bay Area, we take care of people whether they're in Reno or Ashland, Oregon, or Mendocino or Santa Cruz. Taking care of the poor is still a very important part of our mission. And because we're a nonprofit, we charge everybody a modest markup above our cost. That modest markup creates a surplus, and that surplus for 119 years has taken care of the poor in our community. And early in the 20th century, our board of directors, made up entirely of volunteers, our board of directors expanded that definition to say any time someone loses an infant or a child, irrespective of the family's means, we take care of that at no cost to the family, because it's our view that that family's loss represents our community's loss of potential. We are cemetery agnostic. We bury Jews wherever they want to be buried. And that can be among the 27 consecrated Jewish sites for burial in the Bay Area. That can be people who want to be taken under back to their kin because they have a family plot in a town, whether it's Philadelphia, Baltimore. We're sending someone to Baltimore today. We're sending somebody to New York tomorrow. We had a funeral 10 days ago in Argentina. We send people to Eretz Yisrael all the time. We also bring people from places. So somebody has a tragic accident hiking on Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa, and we bring them to us. So we take care of Jews wherever they want to be buried. And even though we own and manage a few cemeteries, we are cemetery agnostic. We never try to sell anyone anything. We try to listen to what you want, and we try to give you what you want, where you want it, and under what circumstances. Be that being buried in a military cemetery in Dixon or being buried at the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem.
Can you tell me, you mentioned people want what they want. One of the things that I've noticed that people want in the Bay Area is cremation. Can you talk about that?
Glad to. Actually, I wouldn't be glad to, but I will. So this is the plate tectonics of our work. Sort of contradictory messages. We think about our job in many ways as helping increase Yiddishkeit in the experience. Even we serve Sephardim too, but we try to elevate our tradition. At this and our tradition, for the most part, does not include cremation. But having said that, the tradition in San Francisco of Jews includes cremation going back to the gold rush in 1849. The two largest Jewish cemeteries in the Bay Area, one is owned by Congregation Shereth Israel, the other is owned by Congregation Emmanuel, both Reform congregations having cemeteries in Colma. Their cemeteries had on-premises crematories going back time immemorial. So we have to be very careful when we're meeting with a family not to be judgmental about cremation. And at the same time, since cremation represents about over 50% of how people choose for their final disposition in America, and over 60% in California, and Marin County, the statistics are kept on a county-wide basis, and Marin County has the leading percentage of cremation in the United States, and it's north of 90%. So cremation is a trend that is coming our way. We deal with this two ways. Someone comes to us and says, Father wanted to be cremated. We make arrangements to cremate Father. The same person comes in and says, Father wanted to be cremated, I think, but Jews don't cremate, do we? It's a completely different response and a completely different conversation from our perspective. And we do our best to do it with no judgment so that when the person makes their decision, they make the decision. But if they're inviting us in to have a conversation about it, we enter the conversation. And if they're not inviting us in, we respect what they want. Now, they may say, having said that, my parents owned, my grandparents bought cemetery property in the Orthodox section at Eternal Home Cemetery. And can my cremated remains be buried there? And the answer is no, they can't be. So we can facilitate cremation. We do not operate a crematory, we facilitate it. And at the same time, there may be limits on where the cremated person can have their cremated remains. The final thing I will say about this is many people come to us and they think that cremation is an alternative to a Jewish funeral. And for us, part of our educational mission is to help them understand that cremation is an alternative to burial. And just because you're being cremated doesn't mean you shouldn't have a can't or shouldn't have a Jewish funeral, that you shouldn't sit Shiva, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can completely embrace the tradition, and you can choose a form of disposition that historically is not well recognized by our tradition.
So just indulge me for 1 second. Someone comes to you and says, yeah, I think dad wanted to be cremated. What sort of arguments do you sort of use to get them to think in the other direction?
So again, we have to listen. We have to have an acute ear. We have to say, you know, in our tradition, we don't cremate. And there have been times and places that we do. But if you were to speak to any rabbinic authority anywhere on the spectrum of rabbinic authorities, whatever stream you're most comfortable relating to, virtually all of them will say, our tradition says don't cremate. And that's where the conversation then begins.
Gotcha. Great. So let's move into a little bit of a discussion about, I don't want to think about this, right? I don't want to think about this, Rabbi, like it'll get taken care of. I'll die and then I'm sure we'll buy a plot. Like, why not just wait? Like, why am I doing this in advance?
How about if I turn this over to Kara?
Let me do that. So I will add her into the spotlight. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kara. So as Sam mentioned, I'm the advanced planning counselor here at Sinai. So if at the end of this call, you are interested in having a follow-up conversation, I am who you will be talking to. So Dan, can you re-ask the question?
Sure. I'm more than happy to ask my question multiple times. Why can't, like, people will say to you, you know what, Rabbi, I'm just going to wait. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going to be, tell you the truth. I might move out of the Bay Area. So I don't know if I want to commit. Maybe it's just, there's too much up in the air at the moment. World is too crazy right now. COVID, everything. You're asking, I can't really make that sort of commitment at the moment. Why should I do it? That sort of thing.
So having a conversation with me doesn't have any commitment attached, right? So a lot of it is just information gathering. So I will say there are a few things that we can do together. Some involve financial commitments, some involve none. So the first conversation we're going to have is me collecting personal information that's needed at the time of need for the death certificate. So when someone passes away, a death certificate's issued and questions are asked about, where were you born? What's your social security number? What's your mom's maiden name? Questions like that about your career. And so those are questions that next of kin might not know the answer to. So like, for example, I don't know my grandmother's maiden name. And so instead of having your next of kin searching through paperwork while they're going through a hard mourning experience, we're able to move forward seamlessly. And so giving me that information, zero commitment, it's preparing for the unknown, right? We don't know what's going to happen or when it's going to happen. And so it just creates a space for if anything happens right now, you're calling Sinai, right? The second piece of questions I'll ask are about the actual arrangements you want. Again, there's no commitment. It's just having what you want in writing, engaging in that conversation, being like, I do want to be buried. I do want a service at my synagogue. I do want, those kinds of questions. And so then there isn't a son saying, I think dad wanted to be cremated. We're like, oh, actually, we know he didn't want to be cremated because we had that conversation. And so it gives you that peace of mind that no one's going to be making choices that you wouldn't have wanted. It also provides a relief of a burden to next of kin and children and or whoever would be taking care of your life is a gift to them. So you're not doing it for you, you're doing it for them.
That's a lot. I love that. This idea, it's a mitzvah to your family, really, is to provide them with, not to leave them not to leave them scrambling, to have to dig up information. They're suffering from a loss, and to, help assist them. It makes maybe the Shiva a little bit easier, or that process a little bit more comfortable to advance plan? Let me ask you more. So let's say I want to advance plan. What are some of the core things I should be considering?
So in terms of like what your services would look like?
No, just, I mean, okay, Kara, I want to plan for my funeral. I'm gonna, I mean, I'm 45, so, I haven't thought about this yet. What should I be thinking about?
Right. So kind of what I just laid out is exactly what I would say to you on that first call. And I would say, these are the three things that we can do together. We can go over these lists of questions, so I have it on file. We can explore possible arrangements, and then we can explore possibly prepaying for those arrangements. Someone who is 45 might be like, I don't know where I'm going to be living. That doesn't, this feels too soon. Okay. So I'm not going anywhere. Let's get it all written down.
I mean, is it at 69 that I make the phone call? Like, I mean, how is that a personal choice that everyone makes? How do you
Sure.
know?
Yeah. I mean, death is not for the old, right? We all experience it. We're all a part of it in one way or another. And things happen. And so it's never too early to have the conversation and just understand. You're really educating yourself, right? I'm 32 and I'm learning so much on a day-to-day basis that I didn't know, to the point where I'm now going home, post-COVID, having conversations with my parents being like, I'm going to have this figured out because I live across the country. My brother's in New York. I don't want to be left out of the conversation. And I don't want anything coming between me and my brother's relationship at the time. And so you're making sure that people are not having misconceptions and arguments about
Well, and families will get into arguments when there isn't the data left behind from their parent or the deceased at some point. If they're in, so to a certain extent, if you advance plan, you can help help decrease the amount of conflicts that could come up. That's right, Sam. Lower the temperature a little bit and say, we have this information. We're blessed to have it. So we don't have to argue over this now because we have a clear idea of am I also intentions? Okay. So my next question for you is, am I buying a plot somewhere? So let me give you I have a family plot. My dad knows we have a family plot in the Montefiore Cemetery in Queens. That seems far. Do I make the plan now to be shipped back to Queens, or do I buy a plot here in San Francisco? And you're helping me make that decision. How do you help me make that decision?
I mean, I'll ask you questions around like, where is your community now? I mean, I'd say our generation looks so different today than it did 50 years ago. So totally. You had people 3 generations ago who were
family
like,
plots.
I'm going to buy out 10 spaces. My grandkids will be here. And now we're just such a much more mobile world at this point, where kids are moving. And like, I live in San Francisco now. I've moved 11 times since I graduated college. So like, who knows where I'm going to be? And so I think.
Yeah, actually, Kara, it's interesting. So my dad's here. Like, Dad, I don't know if you expect me to get buried in that family plot in Queens. Like, is there a family expectation that I'm going to be buried there? Like, I haven't had that conversation with them. And I think part of this is, you don't have to answer now, Dad. Part of this, is beginning to think in this way. What are some of the hardest? I mean, what are some of the obstacles? Where do people get stuck? And
let's stay on that question you just asked.
Yeah, please.
So maybe you moved out here 5 years ago. You plan on living out the rest of your life here. You're part of a congregation. Your congregants have a section of a plot. You have kids who are also going to stay on the West Coast. So now all of a sudden Queens is feeling really far and you're not as attached to that. So
100%.
So maybe we don't. Maybe we just put down the actual plans that you want, regardless of where you're going to be, just so we know, okay, so in the end, he ends up deciding to go to Queens. We still know everything he wants, and we're just going to communicate with that cemetery there, being like, 15 years ago, we had a conversation with Dan. And
you help me buy a plot? Is that something you help me do?
Yeah, so it depends on, if you purchase a plot through us, then I would make an introduction to our property manager, who would want to meet with you, give you a tour. If you're a part of a congregation that has plots.
Oh, you have your own cemetery. Oh, so I see. So Congregation Beth Sholom has its
Mhm.
own cemetery in Home of Peace.
Right.
So you would direct me to that cemetery to then buy that plot. I'm going to ask you one more question because this has come up for me too. There's this, I'm going to use the wrong phrase, but there's this move towards, I want to say organic burial, if you will. Can you speak to that trend? People, like there is a cemetery which is up in San Rafael,
Mhm.
where I did a funeral for someone in a wicker basket. They were buried literally off the side of a mountain. It was actually slick, and I thought I was going to slide down in the middle of but it was really back to the earth. So I mean, is there something going on in terms of that trend? Are people choosing those burials? I guess I'm curious what you found.
So, trend is an interest. I would say, let's say I've sold 100 funerals up until today. I've sold one wicker casket, and I've done 2 eco-friendly.
That's it,
So
eco-friendly.
it's really not trend. When I get it, I'm like, oh, I need to ask the funeral director some questions.
Yeah,
Like
it's much more likely that it will be cremation than to be an
Oh.
eco-friendly burial.
So let me just jump in here for a second. It gets a lot of ink because it's an interesting story, but statistically, it's close to irrelevant. Now, that doesn't mean that it won't always be, but it's not well defined. It's kind of like the term natural foods. I mean, what does it really mean? And the fact of the matter is that Jewish funerals are very ecological and they're very green. A kosher casket is made with no hardware and no animal glue. It's just wood and pegs. Virtually no Jews that we serve are embalmed. There are occasional cases that I can tell you why, but Jews are not embalmed. So there's no chemicals involved. There's probably a slight debate in the world of green burial as to whether concrete liners in cemeteries, whether that concrete is organic or not. I would argue it is because it's cement and sand and water. And most liners are there because they're required by local.
Yeah, so this was new to me, Sam. This was new to me coming from funerals on the East Coast. The concrete liner is a surprise. Was a surprise to to see in all the funerals that we've had in the Beth Sholom Cemetery. The process is we bury the aron, we cover the aron fully with dirt, and then once the aron is covered with dirt, there are these concrete liners that are laid down on top of that dirt, and then we fill in the rest of why are those required by law? I'm really glad to have an expert here who can explain why we have those.
So first of all, the law tends to be based on county level law. And it's not even law, it's land use permits. And the simple answer is that if you've ever, as a kid, gone to, your father took you to visit a Civil War battlefield, you will note that as you're walking, it all looks like this because it all settles. And a visit to Gettysburg, at least once a year, someone's leg falls through. So the purpose of the liner is to give structure to the placement of the aron, and therefore for the cemetery to be flat and for nobody to injure themselves. So that's the simple answer.
Oh.
But for some people, not having a liner may be important. And so, for instance, the Jewish cemetery in Oakland, Home of Eternity, was built before there were land use regulations. And so there are plots there that are unlined, and you can be buried there without a liner if that's what you would like.
And do people's foot and do people's legs fall through?
It's been a while, but they do.
Yeah. I want to open it up to see if anybody has any questions here. Yeah, so Stuart.
Okay, so if indeed you buy a plot and you're 32 years old and you end up moving to another part of the country, do you and you want to be
Does
buried
does
in
the
the other
price
part of the country.
appreciate? Can I do
Exactly.
features?
Can you sell it back and you get the appreciated price, or you get the
Great question, Stuart. And first, this is the only time I'm going to use Latin instead of Hebrew or Yiddish.
Caveat emptor.
Caveat emptor. So if you did that with us and one of our cemeteries, you'd get your money back. You get your money back. Whenever you paid for it. 30 years later, you get your money back what you paid for it. When you buy a cemetery plot, you want to know what their repurchase agreement is going to be, because in some cases, you may not get your money back. You may only own the plot. So caveat emptor. But from our perspective, if someone that we're not in the financial services business, but if somebody's situation changes and they want to get a refund, of course they can have it.
Yeah, but without interest, of course. Judah, you have a question.
But similarly, when you buy a plot from us over time and pay for it over, let's say, 5 years, we don't charge you interest for that either. So it's a reciprocal.
Lovely. Judah?
Yeah, it's not actually a question, just a few comments. When you said cremation or burial, when I lived in San Francisco, I was a palliative care volunteer through JFCS, and my client, who actually lived for 2 years, belonged to Sha'ar Zahav, and he was cremated and then buried, which kind of didn't make sense to me, but that's okay, you know. So anyway, I live in Sacramento now, and actually, you probably knew Gil Lindmer, who was a wonderful man, and he belonged to my synagogue here after he left. I don't know if he was your immediate predecessor or just before you. So anyway, I'm honored to be part of the Chevra Kadisha here. And we have one cemetery for all the different synagogues here. And the Chevra Kadisha is made up conservative, Orthodox, and Reform. And it's interesting, since we have one cemetery, there's a crypt. You know, people go on the wall. And when people go on the wall, they have to be cremated. So then we have, actually, it happened because at first they didn't, and there was a smell. So Orthodox members of the Chevra Kadisha won't work on bodies that are embalmed. And there's all these different things we've got to tap dance through, since we, you know, are made up of all of the different strains, except for Chabad, of course. But when I was at Beth Sholom in San Francisco, Rabbi Lou of blessed memory, he wanted to start a Shomer group. And then, I believe, if memory serves, he found out that you have Shomer at Sinai, and I think it's paid. And when you mentioned you have Chevra Kadisha, is that paid as well? I mean, because here it's interesting, it's all volunteer. We have 2 funeral homes here that know how to do a Jewish burial. So, I mean, that's who people deal with. And when people choose to have a tahara, when they choose to use us, there is a payment, but that payment is put into a fund to bury the indigent. So I guess, you know, if there's a question, all this is, you're the only Chevra Kadisha and Shomer, and are yours professionals?
No, so I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version. So today, there are only 2 Chevra Kadishas in the city of San Francisco. Us and congregations of Sha'ar Zahav, which we trained to do the Tahara work, and they come to our facility to do this, and we welcome them. We have a mortuary in the East Bay in Lafayette. In the East Bay, there are 11 congregationally based chevras, and we welcome them into our facility, and not only to perform tahara and the dressing and tachrichim, we also welcome them to serve as a shomer for the members of their community. And similarly in San Francisco, if someone wants to volunteer to be a shomer because they had a relationship, et cetera, we welcome that. So it's a combination of what I would call professional staff on the one hand, who are well trained in Jewish tradition and the kavanah of the work. And on the other hand, we welcome both congregationally and communally based chevras into our facilities as well.
So if somebody from Beth Sholom died and wanted tahara, which chevra kadisha would do that?
We would do that.
Thank you, Judah. Other questions? Other questions, other thoughts? Anybody? Yeah, Kara, what did you want to say? Oh, you didn't have anything.
No, but I would, what I am going to do is I'm going to put my contact information in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah,
If anyone wants to have a follow-up conversation, I have a link that you can follow. Just, it'll alert me that you want to talk. And so if you don't want to reach out to me
and
directly.
the chat is really simple. It's, who are you? You know, tell us about your background. What would you like? There's no obligation to it. It's just basically to have the information so that there is some place to turn in the event of a tragedy. Raf, you have a question.
Yeah, I joined late, so sorry if this was covered in the first half. But you know, on the vein of planning ahead, trying to put some stuff in place, reduce the burden of your survivors. This feels like a kind of marketing question, but like, are there packages? Like, can someone sell me, like, we'll take care of this and this and this and this, and maybe there's even insurance, you know? Or is it all just on the individual to buy and put in place and do when they get to it?
So kind of a bit of both. So so actually when if you choose to prepay, it will be through an insurance that we'll take out for you. And I would walk you through that process. And there are payment plans for that. And it locks in the price. So the package or the deal is that you get to pay 2021 prices, even if you live 40 more years. And our prices go up every year. So that's kind of the deal. In terms of for yourself, yeah, you're gonna want to have that conversation for yourself. But if you want to have conversations for your parents, or like you're thinking about other people in your life who might not have this planned, you can also call, start figuring that out, call on behalf of them, and start just putting information aside.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some people have parents who aren't able to have these conversations. So how do we support? I mean, how do you? So you would encourage those people who might have parents who can't engage in these conversations, have them call you and begin that process? How does that work? Yeah,
I've created a couple different routes. So like some people don't really feel like being on the phone with me for an hour, and they just want to answer the questions and let me have them. So I have a form that you can fill out that's going to ask you for your mom's maiden name, like all of those vital questions needed at the time. And then if they want to move forward with the service questions, then I want to get on the phone with them so I can kind of hear what they need. There are some people who, like yesterday, I was on the phone with a father, a son, a daughter, and they all wanted to understand so that at the time the kids were fully aware of like what the plans were. Some parents are like, I don't want my kids to know I'm doing this. They don't want to talk to me about it. So, it really is a total range. But my philosophy is I'll get on the phone with anyone, with how many people, in what capacity, and kind of hear what you need.
Thank you, Karen. Barbara? You got to unmute. I need you to unmute, Barbara. Ask to unmute. All right, hold on. We'll get you. Wait, Barbara, you got to unmute yourself for you. We cannot hear you.
Lower left-hand corner, Barbara.
There
you go.
Okay. I'm wondering about the role of music in a traditional Jewish funeral. Is it acceptable to have someone playing some kind of instrument? Is it acceptable to have people pre-plan the music that they want? How does that work?
So great question, Barbara.
Thank you.
And there are two dimensions to this. The first dimension is because your rabbi is the Mara Da'atra, your rabbi answers that question. We don't answer that question.
Only I sing, Barbara, just me.
No.
And once you know the answer to that question, then you can be very, and let's assume for the sake of this conversation, the answer is yes, beyond cantorial music. Assuming the answer to that is yes, you can be exceedingly specific with us and we write it all down and you get what you want. But
yeah, my grandmother, Barbara, my father's mother, she tipped the hearse driver. She pre-tipped the hearse driver. You remember that, Dad? Your mother had paid and laid out absolutely everything down to the tip for the hearse driver. Marty, you have a question.
And thank you so much for all that I'm learning today. Appreciate it, Rabbi, everyone, Sam and Kara. I was just wondering, so thank God it's been a while since I've been to the cemetery. And there's a Beth Sholom section so that there is availability to get some plots at okay, that was my question. Go.
Yes, there are plots at Home of Peace for absolutely. And you know, either Kara or Sam or whomever, I'm sure they'd be happy to connect you with the people at Home of Peace to help you with that process. So I would encourage you to reach out to them and to think first to talk with Kara about the advanced planning, and then to, yes, I mean, I always, when I visit the cemetery, I always make a point to place a stone on Rabbi White's stone and on Rabbi Lou's stone. I always just go to pay their respects, and I, you know, in a certain way, I think of God willing, if things continue to work out well with the shul, that, you know, perhaps there'd be a third rabbi there as well. So that is something that I do consider when I'm at the shul. Marty, yeah, keep going, Marty.
Just to follow up, because I know that there was a section for some reason several years ago. I thought I was investigating and that there wasn't space and they were creating another space, but I guess that was not the case. So I just wanted to make sure. So
I have not, since I've been here, I've not heard about there being a space issue, and there looks like there's plenty of space there to me, just from the eyeballing it. You know, one of the things, Sam, that has come up, and this was pre-COVID, so obviously COVID sort of swamped out the conversation, but people have been asking about whether or not they policy change, to have a policy change around the Beth Sholom, which would be determined, I guess, by me, the Mar Da'atra, to allow for cremated remains to be buried in our plot. There are some congregants of mine who would look to instigate that conversation to change the policy. So while I have you, is that something other synagogues have been doing? What are the policies that are taken by other congregations? And we actually studied a teshuvah, which was written by Rabbi Morris Shapiro of blessed memory, who you might know. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he talked a great deal about the significance of cremated remains, especially in light of the Shoah, and to treat them with proper respect. So I'm curious to know if you've noticed anything, and, you know, in terms of synagogues changing their policies.
So let me just say, I would say that categorically, Reform congregations are comfortable with the idea that cremated remains can be buried with casketed remains, or that cremated remains can be buried in a consecrated Reform section, irrespective of whether they're the second interment in one plot. I would say categorically comfortable. I would say that almost categorically, the conservative shuls are equally uncomfortable. And it doesn't mean that there are not exceptions, because there are, but there are very few. Yeah. I would say that, you know, there's a spectrum of practice and thought in conservative Judaism, ranging from, while I said earlier, just because you've chosen cremation doesn't mean you can't have a Jewish funeral. there are, certainly conservative rabbis who will not officiate at a funeral where there are cremated remains present or where cremated remains are being interred. And certainly our Orthodox brethren there would be no exceptions. And the exceptions are interesting because I was not on here for very long. It was 10, 11 years ago. And I was talking to a woman who was a Shoah survivor who was at the Jewish home, and she wanted to make advanced plans. And she wanted to be cremated, and she wanted to be buried in a traditional way. And it was like, oh, it's like, why? I said, help me understand why this is what you want. And she said, everybody in my family went up in smoke, and I want to go with them. So and Rabbi, your response is spot on. It was like so taken aback. And I thought to myself, we need to be here for her. We need to be here for her. I need to set aside my preconceived notions and say to her, you'll be taken care of the way you want to be taken care of.
Wow. Thank you. Judah?
Memory serves correctly, there are two parts to the Beth Sholom Cemetery. There's a part for intermarriage families, and perhaps that is a solution over in that part where non-Jews are allowed to be buried with the Jews. You could also be where the cremated.
Yeah, do you want to explain that? You want to explain how that works, Sam?
So yes, so I think Judah's solution is actually a pretty interesting one, and we'd be glad to sort of be a sounding board and resource for you as you look at this, because it's complicated. But the traditional approach of a conservative congregation to its cemetery would be to say that the only people who can be buried in that cemetery are either people who were born to a Jewish mother, or if they are a Jew by choice, they were converted with a conservative or Orthodox Beit Din.
You can't be buried with your spouse.
But some have done what Judah suggested, which is to have kind of a secondary section which allows for therefore to be exceptions and therefore probably some simple line of demarcation, so that it's the congregation's cemetery, but it has two sections to it that have its own set of rules. And we help congregations refine their rules all the time. So consider us a resource to help.
Yeah, yeah, good. Sandy Edwards, did you have something that you wanted to say here? I thought I saw you raise your hand for a second.
I did, and it's just an anecdote about my father, who Sinai had a sale on plots, and he needed miles to fly to Italy with my mother. And so he bought the plots on sale, and at that time they were like fully loaded, everything was included. And they went to Italy. And so when it came time to bury him, or my mother first, they had such a good arrangement that they didn't owe any more money. So I just wanted to insert a little levity into this process, but sales help. I don't know, Sam, if you do sales now.
If you wanted to do a sale, we could.
We have the lowest price in town, so we're not likely to.
Thank you, Sandy. But no, I think that goes a long way. Like I think a lot of us, my family, we're planting our roots here in San Francisco. We're raising our family here. This is where, God willing, we're going to be. And I think to begin. The fact that your parents had made those preparations certainly worked out well for them and for you. It was just considerate. Gary.
It'd be on the levity side too, following on that. But first of all, that was not the first time I'd heard that story from a Holocaust survivor. I've heard that several times. But second of all, we made it sound like San Francisco is so weird with cremations. My parents lived on the Upper West Side of New York. They were 2 blocks from Riverside, Memorial, which I think is the largest Jewish funeral home. And they told me 60% of their burials are cremation there. And what they were forced to do was they contracted out with an organization in New Jersey, and they ship them to New Jersey for the cremations. With the sales stuff, it's funny. I don't know. My parents are a little different than Sandy's. When my mother died, my father went to Riverside, made the arrangements there. He thought they did a wonderful job. He thought they were pricey. So one time I was visiting him, and I found him going through spreadsheets on all the other options in New York. And I said, Dad, they're 2 blocks from the house. You're not going to be here. It's simpler for us. They did a wonderful job. And he said, okay. And after he died, I went there. He still had that file with all the stuff in there. But I just went to Riverside and I said, do exactly what my dad did for my mom. That's what I want for my dad. So it's never as straightforward as you think, even when planning is done.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Gary. And I just want to say, like, the fact that Sinai's been here for 100 years, the fact that there's stability here with our world being as crazy as it is, you know, the shul's been here for 100 years, Sinai's been here for 100 years, having that sort of tradition matters in this day and age when things can come and go very quickly, and to know that you can make these advanced plans and that the Sinai will be here and the shul will be here is a very meaningful, and perhaps, you know, it's something that we don't have to run away from. We don't have to shy away from. It can be part of how we understand our commitment to this community. I see we have more hands. So I have 2 more hands. Barbara, and then it says Saul. Barbara, and then I see Marty still has her hand raised, and then we're about out of time. So the last 2 questions. Barbara.
All right.
That's right.
So mine is also adding a little levity, and that is we bought plots many years.
You muted yourself, Barbara.
I'm really not having much luck with the muting today. Okay. Many years ago, we actually bought plots after my father died. We bought plots next to him. And then a good friend of ours' husband died, and they bought plots 2 over. So we've now turned this into a sort of a party. So we have a whole line of plots for good friends and ourselves, and my dad is already there. But in terms of when you do that, you get to choose your landscape, basically. And so what I remember is walking around and trying to say that it was probably good to choose a plot toward the front because it would be easier for the children when they visited. And then we all laughed.
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay.
Yeah, you do. You know, you get to. In fact, I was talking with a congregant who recently worked with Home of Peace, and she, you know, is you know, planning to be next to one of her best friends, and that's, you know, really the opportunity that you have when you plan in advance. We have more time for one more question. So, Marty, you can ask the last question. Yeah.
And it's just a comment that I appreciate, because coming from Chicago, that's where my family is. The cemetery's there, and my dad bought all the plots, and we all have plots, my brothers and all of the families connected. And yet one of my other brothers and myself are not in Chicago. So listening to people saying, yeah, they start thinking, where's the community? And I, you know, and now our daughter will be coming back here too. And I think I need to be here, but it is hard to separate that out. And yet times change, and listening to you and everyone is very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. I've actually, yeah, as I mentioned, I thought about that myself, going back to Queens or being here. It's something that is worth thinking about. And so Sam's going to get the last word, but before I give him the last
word, just one last thought that I think is important.
Sure.
You know,
I was going to thank you first, but go right ahead.
Sometimes there are conflicts in families, and people know that there are conflicts in families where they are not sure, as they do their advanced plan, how things are going to be resolved. In the state of California, and this is not true of all states, in the state of California, if you have made arrangements for yourself and you have prepaid for those arrangements, they can only be materially changed by you. So we occasionally will find someone who says, someone will come to us and say, you know, I'd really like to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. If I tell my kids this, they're going to think I'm nuts. They'd rather have the money to spend on a cruise. What can I do? Because I don't want to have a fight with them now, and I don't want to have a fight with them after I'm gone. What can I do to make sure I get what I want? And there's a simple answer, which is you can pay for it in advance. You can work with Kara, you can pay for it in advance. And when the time comes and someone says, oh, Dad was really meshuggah about that, can't we just bury him in Coleman? The answer is no, you can't, because we are obligated by law to honor his wishes. So to the extent that someone wants to avoid conflict, there is an answer in California, which is you can pay for it in advance, and only you can then change your mind. And you can change your mind if you want, but nobody else can.
Thank you, Sam. People like avoiding conflict in California. So I just want to thank, I want to thank Kara. I want to thank Sam for really coming to us with this. It's not an easy topic. Obviously, we have to consider our own mortality in doing it, but we've seen not only from the Torah and Chayei Sarah, Parshat Chayei Sarah, it's sort of the tradition of our tradition, but also the lessons learned, but also, as Kara explained, it's just a beautiful mitzvah. You know, at every funeral, I always say before we shovel the dirt onto the aron, I always say that this is a mitzvah, the purest mitzvah, because it can't be reciprocated by the deceased. It's something that you do purely to show the kavod and respect, and it's selfless because there's no part of reciprocation that is there. It's just done out of love and out of commitment. And so perhaps that mitzvah can be extended to you before we pass away, which is perhaps we can extend a little kindness and grace and love towards those who will be burying us. So I want to thank Sam and Kara. Encourage everyone, if you didn't get a chance, let me just post it again. The link, it's on our website. But here is his book, if anybody wants to download that PDF. And in addition, Kara is here. She's got her information. So I want to invite all of you to be in touch with her. For those who are watching on YouTube, Kara, they can get in touch with you. How? What's your email? Or
You can email me at cwalden@sinaichapel.org, or you can call me at 415-921-3636.
And thank you so much. And in my experience here at San Francisco, I will tell you that one of the strongest, most reliable Jewish institutions is Sinai. I mean, it's the one that I've leaned on the most since my arrival. Naturally, I think a lot of rabbis will lean on them, but they're have always been wonderfully professional and responsive. And so we're blessed to have them in our region and in our city. So kol hakavod to all of the work that you do. And thank you for coming and participating in this conversation. All right, take care,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
Have a good afternoon.
Well,